Olá, este é o Agroamérica, programa produzido em participação com o Instituto Interamericano de Cooperação para a Agricultura, o ICA, aqui no canal AgroMais. Falamos sobre boas práticas agrícolas que podem ser reproduzidas nos 34 países membros no hemisfério americano. E o assunto de hoje é a agricultura regenerativa no Canadá. A nossa entrevistada, falando diretamente da província de Ontário, no Canadá, Gillian Flies, que é produtora rural e presidente da Associação de Produtores Orgânicos Canadenses. Hi, Gillian. It's a pleasure to have you here on Agroamerica.
Hi, thanks. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your participation. So I wanted to start out getting into the theme of regenerative agriculture, speaking about how you began as a farmer around 15 years ago, as I understood, with organic production. How did that begin?
So my husband and I are farmers, but we're actually not your traditional farmers. We worked in political development and parliamentary reform in Africa and Asia for about 12 years before we started farming. And when we moved back to Canada, we wanted to get involved in issues that were important here. And we looked around and saw climate change and global warming, human health, a breakdown of rural communities. And we recognized that it all came back to the way that we grow our food. And so we decided to start a farm, a small scale organic farm, and prove that it was possible and start to address some of these issues.
And how was the transition between farming organic produce to looking at regenerative agriculture? What was the tipping point that you had to change the way that you were doing your farming?
It's really interesting. We actually started farming in around 2006. And it wasn't until 2017 that we started to hear a lot about regenerative agricultural practices. And at the time, we were definitely noticing changes in the climate around our farm. It was drier, it was getting hotter, the seasons were changing a little bit. And so, interestingly, organic agriculture, certified organic agriculture already has many of the regenerative practices mandated. But we started to add some additional practices that have been super helpful, including no-till. So we're a very reduced till farm now. Increasing biodiversity is another one. We rotationally graze cattle and have silvopasture on our farm, which is really important. So some of these practices that we started implementing on top of organic have been hugely beneficial to our farm.
Fantastic. And your farm, it's called the New Farm, located in Creemore. It was actually the first Canadian farm to have a certificate in regenerative agriculture. Is that correct? What is the criteria in order for you to be certified with this certificate?
Yeah, it's a really interesting new program called the Regenerative Organic Certification, the ROC program. It's interesting because in Canada, the organic standard is already pretty stringent. But on top of that, they have more of a 360-degree view. So the first thing that we had to do was create records of our crop rotations. They're very interested in reduction in tillage, your diversity of crops that you're rotating around, the rotation that you have, how you rotate in animals. But they look at things like how you treat your staff. Are the farmers on your farm making a living wage? How do you interact with your community? What are your animal welfare practices? And so they add in, they kind of go just a little bit next level where they go deeper and actually require some of the suggested practices that are in organic agriculture.
So it's not only about finding ways to implement regenerative agricultural practices, but we're talking about what you could consider ESG practices as well, where you have governance criteria, you have social criteria, environmental criteria as well, included in this certificate. And what is the entity that gives the certificate in Canada today?
So the organization, the ROC certificate was originally developed by the Rodale Institute and Patagonia and some other companies like that. And it's a standard that exists in the States. And then globally, it is administered by the same certification bodies that do the organic standard. So we first certify with ProCert, which is our organic certification body here in Canada. And then on top of that, there's a second inspection and a number of requirements that let us go to the regenerative organic cert.
Fantastic. So with this kind of certificate, you can consider that your farm, along with other farms that have the certificates, are able to restore also the quality and the health and the life of the soil that you're producing in. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's really amazing. So we have only been, as I mentioned, implementing these, especially the no-till practices, since 2017. And we're in a farming area. So we now have majority of our soil is between, when you talk about soil organic matter, and I feel like the audience will be familiar with that, but that's a measure of how healthy your soil is, the structure, and a direct relation to how much carbon is captured in your soil. And so on a standard Canadian farm, it's about 2, maybe 3%. Our neighbors across the road are actually at about 1.5% because of their constant practice of tilling and chemicals and crops like corn, soy, and wheat. And we've managed to build our soil organic matter up to between 4.5% and 6%. And the really exciting thing about that is what it does for our farm. So it gives you structure in your soil, for example, so that for every 1% you increase, you can absorb approximately 25,000 gallons more per acre of water when you have a rainstorm, for example. And so what that means on the ground for us is that when our neighbors are waiting to plant, we can be on our soil about a month earlier. It also gives you really good structure for retaining water. So when we have these heat waves that we're now getting in Canada that would traditionally not allow us to germinate things like spinach or arugula, or would be really damaging to these delicate crops, we have a lower temperature in our soil, which allows us to continue to germinate and not have to irrigate nearly as much. And so those are some of the things that we're really noticing about implementing these practices on our farm.
And what were some of the initial challenges? I mean, you were already producing on your farm. There was a necessity to produce organic food, right? I mean, we're not talking about large-scale grain or cereal production. We're talking about your vegetables, your crops, your fruits, in order to sell for the population, guaranteeing nutrition, right? Guaranteeing
Yes.
safety for consumption, adequate consumption in Canada. And what were some of the initial challenges to implement the types of regenerative agriculture practices that we're doing, which includes, maintaining the soil covered with different types of crops, as you said as well, having a crop rotation as well in this area so that the soil can retain some of these necessary fertilizing components. But what were the initial challenges that you faced?
It's really funny because we have implemented many of these practices, such as cover cropping, which you're talking about, on our farm for years as an organic farm. But there wasn't a lot of information out there in 2017 that was readily accessible to us on how to implement these practices on a farm of our scale. In fact, there's way more information out there, and to some degree, it's quite a bit easier to implement these on large cropped fields than on this type of an operation. And so, it's a bit embarrassing to admit as a farmer, but it was trial and error. So we had soil that was used to being farmed in a certain way, our rotation of cover crops, and we would disc that in. We tilled a lot on our farm to manage weeds. And so learning how to utilize cattle to take down those crops, to rotate them in and out, along with, as you very importantly point out, maintaining the food safety element of when you can have them. Crops of new and different kinds of weeds like chickweed that appear in your first year or two when you're making the transition. So we had a lot of frustrations, also learning how to, follow one cover crop with another and another without tilling it in. It was a real learning experience for us. But now that we're several years in, the benefits are incredible to the difference in our weed pressure and our fertility. We've never used a gram of nitrogen fertilizer on our farm. We do not use manure, animal manure on our farm. We try to be a closed input farm as much as we can. And so we're able to capture all of our nitrogen atmospherically through the cover crops that we're using. It's way cheaper.
Awesome. Could you tell me a little bit about the initiatives that you and your husband have been developing in order to foment that other farmers get into this type of farming, specifically the Farms for Change program, which I'd like to know a little bit of how it works, especially financially, and what are the objectives for this program, please?
Sure. Yeah, we have three really important initiatives that I would love to tell you about. There's Farmers for Climate Solutions, which is involved in policy, the Regeneration Center that we're building on our farm, and then also Farms for Change, which we started 12 years ago. So when Brent, my husband, and I started farming, we came at this as a political issue and a human rights issue. And we started growing really beautiful organic food. And we noticed that it was going to very high-end restaurants, and also local community members who were quite wealthy were starting to buy this in the farmers market. And so we were aware of some organizations called community food centers down in Toronto, Ontario, and they have 16,000 clientele, for example, at one of their locations who access their food bank and regular meals. And so we started to just donate as many of our vegetables as we could, but we weren't making much money at that point, and we couldn't really afford to do that. And so we started having fundraisers to raise money from our community to buy our vegetables, to send them into these organizations. So in essence, we're sort of selling our vegetables to donors and taking the effort of raising the money on events rather than selling them, say, in retail stores. We also took 10% off the top of all of our retail products and donated that into the program as well. And so after 10 years, we've sent about $1.5 million worth of food. We're now working with 15 good food organizations across various parts of Southern Ontario. And they have the ability to order just like a restaurant. So we don't sort of give them what we have to offer. They're able to order with all of our restaurants, receive single or biweekly deliveries, and they get really beautiful organic, regenerative organic greens and cucumbers and those types of things from the farm.
And do you think that this model can be reproduced in other parts of the world, in other parts of Canada as well? Can farmers, or should farmers, in your opinion, get together to implement this type of regenerative agricultural practices, and also think about this type of model? Because in essence, it guarantees also that the farmer can receive an adequate amount of money for his or her efforts, as well as its production costs in the farm, but as well it guarantees quality, and it guarantees also access to quality food to the consumer. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's exactly what you're saying. That's the concept behind why we do this. And it is very replicable. So we've actually worked with farms down in Ottawa, also out in a town near here in Mount Forest, where they have different names for their initiatives, but they get a bunch of farmers together and they have an event. And it's almost like a prepaid CSA, like a community supported agricultural model. Mm-hmm. So the vegetables are bought at the beginning of the year, and then they're distributed as needed to those organizations through the season.
So about Farmers for Climate Change, Climate Solutions, what is right now the scale of this organization, and what are the main objectives of this organization?
Farmers for Climate Solutions is a coalition now of 24 progressive farming organizations across Canada. And these organizations represent over 20,000 farmers that are conventional, regenerative, organic, all across the spectrum. And what we've recognized is that no big change happens without policy change. It's like seatbelts or smoking in restaurants in Canada. And so we also recognize as farmers that we have big issues to face around resiliency on our farm as we face climate change and climate chaos, quite frankly. And so the goal of this coalition is to advocate for climate-friendly agricultural policy, but also to get government to support farmers for these eco-services, which will the ultimate objective is to have more resilient farms in Canada, but also to really reduce our GHG emissions. We're responsible for 13% of GHG emissions, agriculture in Canada.
So there was an initiative not only to implement this by yourselves, but as well as get into the political side to keep and incentive for farmers as well to keep the carbon on the floor. So what are some of the details on the demands of these farmers, of this organization that you also represent? And why is it important to get into the political aspect of keeping this carbon on the floor? I mean, we've understood as well from the IPCC reports, as well as from the COP26, that this is also an international concern and that governments are willing to invest and also finance this kind of initiative.
Yes, I mean, it's really exciting. So the way that Farmers for Climate Solutions works is that we put together task forces focused on specific funding mechanisms that the Government of Canada is using to support agriculture. So for example, the biggest way that farms are funded for things like agri-insurance and crop programs in Canada is called the Agricultural Policy Framework, which is coming up. So we put together a task force of GHG modelers and scientists and farmers and economists, and we come up with very solid recommendations that are implementable for government. So when COVID hit, which is when we first came together a couple of years ago, we put out some immediate needs around, we looked at the practices that would be most impactful in putting this carbon back into the ground, because the goal here is that we need to get this carbon back into the ground quickly. We're running out of time to make that happen. And we have this army of farmers around the world who are sitting on land in which they can start sequestering carbon really quickly. So the recommendations, the practices that came to the top were cover cropping, rotational grazing, and nitrogen fertilizer management. So the Government of Canada at the federal level was actually in April of 2021, basically cut and paste those recommendations because they were very solid into their budget, and we had asked for $300 million to be released to pay farmers to implement these practices, and they released $270 million. They have subsequently released another $900 million towards the type of recommendations that FCS is putting out. And we've just completed another task force with a very big ask, actually, listing 18 practices that should be included. And this is things like paying for cover crop seed, paying for advisors for farmers to get nitrogen management plans in place, paying farmers to purchase fencing and to take training on how to rotationally graze their animals. The second half of Farmers for Climate Solutions is working on training. So we have a grant over 4 years. We are training 10,000 farmers across Canada on these three practices in a peer-to-peer model. So we are training farmers who will be working with farmers in their area to learn cover cropping, rotational grazing, and nitrogen fertilizer management, so that they're ready when they get this funding from government to actually implement successfully.
Fantastic. And Gillian, what is the challenge perhaps, or if there are initiatives of this program, to include as well large grain and cereal farmers as well as livestock farmers around Canada?
Yeah, the main target, especially around the nitrogen management plans and cover cropping, is the very large scale commodity croppers in the prairies. That's the first part that we're hitting hard, because that's the biggest area for impact. So we're really focusing on that to start. And then of course, rotational grazing is very important, and the two can be mixed. They're not often mixed, but they can be.
Fantastic, fantastic. I think there's an opportunity for new farmers who are starting out, as well as current farmers who are trying to diversify not only their produce, but their income, to look at how to keep carbon on the ground, which is a big challenge in some parts of the world where some of these farmers may not have the information, may not have perhaps the technical assistance that is needed, or even the machinery that is necessary to implement these types of initiatives. So I wanted to know from you, who has a very valuable experience in Canada, what can be the first steps for these farmers to get into regenerative agriculture?
Well, some of the most important steps that you can take right away are to reduce tilling the soil if possible. That had the biggest impact on our farm, and we're seeing that that has a massive impact on farms across Canada. The second thing is to wean yourselves off nitrogen fertilizer. It's very possible to get all of the ability that you need through the capture of atmospheric nitrogen through cover crops, which also helps with your soil structure. And you know, that starts saving you money. So that's another way. I mean, obviously, the thing that's working in Canada right now is to get political. So to come together with other farmers and demand change and try to help demonstrate why you're part of the solution and what you have to offer as far as sequestering carbon. It's becoming very well known globally, and there are a lot of resources for that.
So when we're talking about climate change, we see the impact that farmers have. And what about the economic impacts, not only of this kind of initiative, but also looking at someone who has an organic farm, for example, and that maybe organic produce isn't as accessible currently to the consumer market. Is there anything that these farmers can do to maybe find a middle ground other than the example that you have already announced, right, to find finance directly from the consumer? Or right now, do you see that as the only viable way maybe to find a middle ground between the high costs of organic production and allowing consumers to have more access to them?
You know, it's really interesting because previously a lot of the cost of conventional agriculture, conventional produce was externalized to, say, the environment. And the reason that organic agriculture, you know, organic food costs more is these costs are included. You know, you don't externalize those costs. But what we're seeing with the increase in price, especially of fossil fuel, is that it's evening out. Like the cost of conventional food is going way up, and the cost of organic food is not following on that same trajectory. So when you look at being able to make this a more viable option, the gap is shrinking. You know, and the other thing is that there are a lot of conventional farms that if you don't start adopting some of these practices, your soil, you won't be able to farm in your soil in any meaningful way when you get these big storms that are coming through or the big heat waves. We have farmers out in Saskatchewan that we're working with that have to harvest their crops at night at 2 o'clock in the morning, because if they harvest during the day last year, the sparks from their equipment would burn their whole fields down. So we're, you know, it's not just about making the food accessible and building demand, which is important, but it's actually being able to continue farming.
Impressive, impressive. And how is that reality across Canada? I mean, we're talking about a very large country that has an expansion all the way to the Arctic, and obviously it's not as easy or possible in the majority of the year, especially in winter, to grow these crops. But majority of the population, as well as the agriculture production, is in the south of the country. A very large country with a lot of large plains, such as in Saskatchewan, in the province of Manitoba, as you mentioned. So how is this reality there, given the climate change at the moment?
The biggest impact of climate change right now in Canada is being felt out in the prairies. So that includes Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. And that's also where we have the majority of our conventional commodity cropping that's going on. So, you know, it's the two are going hand in hand at the point. So that is our biggest focus right now, is trying to assist those farmers with resiliency, helping them reduce their input costs while they grow, and, you know, helping them transition. And at the same time, we're really working hard on communications programs to build demand, which is, I had mentioned earlier, here at the New Farm, we're now in the process of developing the New Farm Center for Climate Action, which will be a full demonstration farm of regenerative agriculture to work with big companies and help provide education and drive demand for regenerative organic and regenerative products.
That is fantastic. Well, Gillian Flies, our time is up, and I'd like to thank you so much for your participation here. It's wonderful to have this information and to understand how is regenerative agriculture in Canada, as well as what is going on with the farmers in the country. Thank you so much for your participation here in our program.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you. E para você que nos assistiu até agora, muito obrigado pela audiência. Ficamos por aqui e te aguardo no próximo Agroamérica. Tchau, tchau.